Hello? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, hey Chris, how are you?
Good, how are you? Sorry I'm late. I just got off of back-to-back Zoom meetings all day long, so you probably know what that's like.
That's life. Like, is there another life? I'm unaware.
I know, I mean, it never used to be this bad, but now this time I had to like switch from one Zoom account to another. It was just, it's terrible.
It's
But
like I go a lot between Teams, Google Hangouts, and Zoom.
yeah, I used to do that, but the client I had that used Google Hangouts all the time, I lost them. So it's just Zoom and Teams now. It's just bam, bam, bam.
Amazing. Yeah. Teams is funny. It seems to update quite a lot.
Oh yeah, I think well, it's relatively new, so it needs a lot of refreshing. I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
Awesome. So it's great to finally talk to you. Sorry about the schedule mishap earlier, but hey, without internet, you are nothing nowadays, right?
Yes, we are. I mean, it's the key. Infrastructure truly is all we need.
Yeah, yeah, basically, right.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your organization, what you're passionate about, and we'll go from there.
Okay. So my name's Mordecai. I am rather mononymous, not in a difficult way, but it's easier for everyone. It keeps the friends knowing what to call me and everybody in line with that.
I
So
love,
I'm
I love it.
not the hawk from the Royal Tenenbaums, but maybe we have the same personality. So that's all right. So I am an innovation executive. I've been at Hyundai. I've worked for clients such as Apple, Hilton Hotels, to Warner Brothers, CBS, Reddit, things like that. And then I also have my own consultancy, which is just Mordecai Inc. Let's not be complicated with that either.
Very cool.
Especially on the road of innovation, we try to keep it as simple as possible and as minimalist as possible so we can do great things in a white space.
Yeah,
And so for
absolutely.
me, innovation is simply tackling technology, culture, and simple good ideas. And that's going all the way from insight to actual practice.
Very cool. Very cool. So first of all, I've been thinking about going the one name route too, because
Yeah,
Calabucus is pretty good, pretty unique. You know, nobody else
good.
has it. It's really easy when I'm searching for patents on the internet because I just put that name in and it comes right up. You know, I have all these friends of mine who are like named Smith and whatever, and they have like they just can't find any of their patents. But so you've run the gamut from a lot of different in a lot of different organizations, from like Hyundai to Reddit, and
Mhm.
like tell me a little bit about the differences that you see in places like that.
You know, when you're in innovation, part of your job is to find the place that you can provide solution.
Mhm.
So whatever those organizations are, I started working with Reddit at the time that Alexis Ohanian had come back, and they were in a bit of a rebirth phase. At Hyundai, you have a storied industry that has been, Hyundai began as a rice company. That was what they were about originally. And now they're a bit more steel, and then in the future, hydrogen and so on. But in all of these companies, it really is working with executives and serving as one to make sure that we're just finding these solutions. So I do work around a varied group of industries, especially being in culture. People are always like, oh, you get to do the cool stuff. I actually really enjoy doing the not cool stuff. I
Mhm.
like doing the things that can affect lasting change, be it just in the infrastructure of things and organizational practices, to new technologies that can disrupt how we make purchases in future. So though some of them read as like forward thinking companies, I mean, what Reddit just did at the Super Bowl yesterday, a 5-second ad in the Super Bowl is pretty great and disruptive. I mean, I wasn't involved in that in any way, but I definitely liked a lot of their LinkedIn's around it. But whatever that is, I think we're all striving to communicate with people and have new conversations and find new ways to have those dialogues. So whatever the brand is, that's what I'm looking for in that space. I prefer to work with brands, though, that really affect the globe.
Right, but it seems like there's a big challenge. There's a different challenge between innovation in a place like Hyundai and an innovation in a place like Reddit, right?
Mhm.
I mean, you've got to come at it in completely different ways, and you've got to communicate it in different ways, and it means different things
Mhm.
to each of them. So how do you go through those, and how do you make something? I mean, I think, but innovation in general also has a more generic explanation. Although, what they say, it's different for everybody. So
Mhm.
how do you rationalize it depending on the organization?
Well, it is, what are their objectives? So obviously Reddit is a platform. I've also partnered with Soho House before. That's about making members happy. When you're doing a Warner Brothers, it's making sure that you're marketing a film. You know, each of these has a unique perspective, and they are very different in their approaches. And really, I think the key to it is the longevity of the innovation roadmaps that you can build for them. So if I look at things that I've done with a Soho House and more of those cultural places, I've done a lot of work with a lot of the talent agencies, particularly in Los Angeles. And those projects have been not stunt innovations, but short term, similar to a film. We're just trying to create a cultural moment, and how can we engage in that, and then moving it forward. While when you work with companies such as Apple, such as Hilton a little bit, and then particularly with Hyundai, those are long roadmaps. You're disrupting how in which we're, like I've mentioned, the purchase decision, because digital retail solutions so came to the forefront in the last year, and we were able to accelerate those roadmaps. But that to me is the key differentiator of the kinds of innovation and the kinds of work that we're doing. Is, are we talking about a 6-month roadmap where we're going to test out a product and have a cool moment and win some awards and get some press? Or are we changing the way in which our company works?
Right. So the final definition of innovation is basically creating something that your customers love, or is that just,
I don't know if I would define
innovation
as that, but that is the practice. Is I do it. Obviously, I work in marketing for the most part of it. So it is creating ways in which we're resonating with customers in the world that they want to have. And so I define that innovation as a cross technology culture and the simple good ideas. But really it is, how are we engaging them in the ways that they want to be engaged and will be.
right? So does innovation need to be profitable?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so quite fundamentally, because I want to have job security. I want my team to have job security. And I am not interested in just being charisma. So for this podcast, that's all I'm interested in. But, overall, I have found, and sort of what has separated me a little bit from the herd, is that I do care about the bottom line, because I do care about those internal innovations. Innovation as a practice in big corporations by nature is a reason that talent stays around, because you do the cool things. So it's a reason that emerging talent wants to commit to the organization and be in long term. So you are deeply embedded into making sure that people want to work where they are enthused to come to work in that space. It does fall particularly on an innovation group to make sure that's happening. So in terms of the financials, not only do I want to make my company's money and have that space, but I also want to make sure that my P&L is well and healthy, and that we are growing appropriately for that, for just simple sanity.
Yeah. Because have you seen situations where companies like roll in and out of innovation groups? Like they'll come in hot and bothered. There'll be like a new CEO. He'll say, "Oh yeah, I want to do something innovative. I'm turn this into an innovative company." They'll staff up like crazy, build a huge innovation group, and then about 2 years later, there's really no output in general.
Yes.
And then they start cutting back. Have you seen that happen often?
Yes, and I've actually been brought into roles that was the expectation at the time.
Right.
So, I've come in where, when I've delivered revenue after year one, like my CEO has been like, "You didn't have to do that."
Mm-hmm.
We didn't ask for it. I'm like, I did have to do that. I had to do that for myself. I had to do that for innovation overall. All the reasons we just spoke about. But it's not in contract at initial hire. It is not usually a requirement. The dazzle, the making sure you're in an agency world, making sure you're in new business, making sure that you're speaking a lot, having conversations like we're having right now, making sure that you're bringing trends and thought leadership into the rooms. All of that is a part of it. But again, for sustainability and true progress, you really want to get across the entire agency or company and make sure that you're embedded there with purpose, and money talks.
Right. So that's the way you do it, right? I mean, if you don't have some low-hanging fruit, I hate that term, low-hanging fruit that actually brings in the revenue, shows the profitability right away, then it's kind of like, well, you can't just wait and wait and wait. It's eventually, you know, they've got to see something on the bottom line, no matter what the conversation was at the very beginning, to say, okay, we need an innovation group and we don't care how long it takes till we see something out of it, but they do.
Yeah. And I think, you know, what's laid out when you do get it to weave across an organization and you become a valuable member of every person's team, you know, and it takes a lot of footwork. I think that's weird to say in a remote work environment, but that is what it is. You know, I can remember like I did a lot of calls for like the CSR group of one of the companies I worked with. And they're like, you don't have to worry about me. I'm just over here. I was like, no, you're part of leadership. You are part of the family. If I can support your efforts as I'm also working over here, that, you know, across group is really important to be weaved into the fabric, because not only money, but I want to make sure that in this space, I am being able to be reachable and valuable to each member. So that I'm not just the dazzle that comes in at the last minute and just has concepts that not only am I running a business, but I'm here to support yours.
So what do you do in situations where, I mean, a lot of times innovation groups that want to show this profitability, they got to do near-term stuff, things that can be launched today. But then you've got, you know, politics and other parts of the organizations that say, wait a minute, why are you working on chatbots? We're working on chatbots. Why are you working on AI? We're working on AI. How do you deal with that kind of sort of ownership within organizations?
One of the things that I hold on to and I try to instill, and that's in the process of getting involved in all the different groups, is that I am not here to own certain categories. I'm here to bridge. So chatbots is a really good example. You know, then you end up with a digital team is like, hey, no, that's me. I am there to provide innovative solutions and to help you make the best decisions in that. The best day for me is when I hand over a product. Right. So augmented reality is a good example of that. Recently, you know, oftentimes, particularly in marketing, they just go to people, come over to my office and they go, we want to do something in VR. And they actually meant AR. And they're like, that's the only thing that they think innovation is these. Now, I am going to tell a story about AR, so I'm falling into the trap. But when we started, it was a stunt. You know, we did a cool stunt, concert, you know, all the cool things, you know, announced it at Cannes Lions, like all the buzz. There you go. Tick, 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 you know. But in that process, we also built, this was for Hyundai, we built a Sonata in AR and it looked good. You know, I'm biased because I oversaw it, but it looked good. And what we found out through doing that fun stunt with a bunch of cool bands and like Lizzo and Billie Eilish or whatever, was we found out that people spent 7 minutes in augmented reality with the Sonata. That's a proof point that I can move forward. I then took it to Google. We put it into AR search. Now we've proven scalability. So then when we ended up in there's a new website coming out for Hyundai, and obviously we ended up in COVID and digital retail solutions needed to come forward. Now AR is going to be a part of the purchase process.
Yeah.
And absolutely. I've handed that over to the same digital producers that got to be a part and in the room for the cool stunt. Now they run it. They know who to go to. And that is the best part of my job, because I'm now on other technologies. You know, I'm awaiting the time that I can pass on gesture and not have to deal with gesture anymore, but instead I still have to root for it.
Right. No drones yet.
Drones are drones, you know, like, but that's the point. Is to me, I'm meant to be your bridge. So I don't go in to compete with digital, like, oh, no one gets to do augmented reality except me, but I am subject matter expert. So how do I show up to that and help you make the best decisions, be those budgetarily? You know, companies will come in and quote something. I'm like, that's unnecessary. Yeah. You know, have another look.
Some of the companies I've worked with, they're very, very protective of these technologies, like especially the chatbots thing. I mean, we were doing, the innovation group that I was working with was doing sort of future chatbot technologies, not of today, chatbots of tomorrow, but they weren't interested in weren't interested in partnering with anybody. They were saying, we own chatbots and that's it. And if you're doing something that says chatbots on it, you're a threat to us. So we just basically had to say, okay, fine, you have chatbots. We didn't even bother innovating in that space. We just had to step away. Have you ever needed to do that?
I have needed to do that. But I also, be it my seniority in a certain place or certain time, I always just try to make it clear the door is open. So I do a lot of things that are pretty standard innovation, like host innovation days, do speed dating of a bunch of technologies. I oversee all of the, CES, South by Southwest, Viva Technology, all of those big show floors when we had them, of going through. So because I'm there, I try to, if I know a group, for instance, owns this space and is future checking out the chatbots, like your example, usually I'm sneaky and I'll do something like say, hey, while I'm at CES, do you want to meet with this company? Do you guys just have a chat? And find those ways to not put myself in the center of the conversation where all things have to go through me, but more be like, I'm here to be your bridge.
Right.
I'm not your threat. I make my money over here doing my own projects. If this is your project, I just want to support you.
Right. So you come at it from you want to help them, you're supporting them in whatever they're doing. And if it's in an area that doesn't exist in the organization, then you just take it on in that way.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's important on the other side of that scenario. So if opinions were reversed, so if it's a lane that you own and someone else is saying, I want to explore that, I think it is important in that situation to make sure that you have locked in your lanes. So, I'm not here to compete, but if I've sold in something, especially when I work with global organizations, you'll always find out like, oh, someone in India is working on this in this other way. It's the nature of
somewhere is always working on it.
Well, I come from entertainment. So for me, it's all creativity. It's just like, there is no original idea. Seinfeld was being thought about by someone else, a show about nothing somewhere else. It just happens to come together where it does. And that's absolutely fine. So I think about it in the same way, but if you do own something, to make sure you do have that lane. And then it's like, how can I benefit you? My roadmap is this. This is where I'm headed. These are the partners that I've been with, and this is why we're moving it forward this way.
Yeah. But the reality is that all these things are so broad that you can't really own the whole thing anyway. I mean, chatbots is extremely broad, especially, and in this same company I was working with AI. They started an AI group, and they started an AI group. So it's like, okay, nobody else is allowed to talk about anything under AI and machine learning, predictive analytics, forget it. You have to go through our AI group. And I'm like, wait a minute, there's just too much there for any one team to work on, especially when you want to drill into specific innovations that cross boundaries. And there's just some organizations that are a lot more, I guess, protective of their little areas than others.
I mean, quite frankly, if someone said to me, we own AI, I would say, do you also own white paint? I mean, it's just, you're talking about something that's everywhere. And how the mere thought that someone's even saying, I own AI, when it's white paint.
I should say that next time somebody says that.
You know what I mean? I mean, I get what you're saying, but it is just like, then you're not understanding the practice of it, because it's everywhere. So
exactly. So it sounds like you've had most of your engagements, you've had a pretty open leadership to these initiatives. Have you ever been in a situation where it hasn't been as open, and how you've been able to sort of help move innovation along?
In terms of being in sort of a hard environment of, a lot of naysayers, or in terms of just really believing in something?
Corporate innovators, and they struggle day in, day out to try and get innovations moving, get products to market. How do they go from sort of just conceptualizing and getting their leadership to understand that, this is an essential service that they're providing?
Well, I think that in recent years, I have traded on the benefit of being in global organizations. And the importance of that is that an initial no can turn into a yes somewhere else. My joke at Hyundai was, where there's a won, there's a way. And I held quite close to that for a while, because when you have the nuance to be able to support the organization at large, you have the opportunities to find yeses in other departments. So to me, it's working through that. I can hear a no, and I can hear when something isn't going to move forward. But I also think that's part about owning your budget and owning your team. I know where my team is allocated towards, and sometimes this will go over onto the left side, and sometimes it'll go on the right, and sometimes it'll be what you want. But I do want that autonomy to make sure that I can pursue projects that can move forward. But when I find the lane, when that solution comes up, and it's all relations, it's knowing the head of brand in Korea, in India, in Europe, and them knowing your number.
Right.
To say, we have room for the lane right now.
Right. And they know how to reach you.
And it's important on my side that I have enough projects that I never become reliant on one thing, that I'm never the group that is only like, well, I have to get AI out into the business by the end of the year. How is that going to happen?
Right. It's got to be much more flexible than that.
Yeah. And much more varied, and, across these different elements.
Very cool. Very cool. So tell me about this. You said, when I first read this note that you sent me, it's like how activism made you ad woman. I thought it said mad woman for a second there. I'm like, oh, this is going to be interesting.
I mean, I don't know who's talking, so I'll let anyone say whatever they want to say, because, I get the mad woman side, but I don't drink enough to be that. So, that goes. Yeah, I mean, it may read, if you look on any of my social profiles, I say I'm an activist and an ad woman. Activism has always been my first career. And as I've continued to be an innovator, I never thought that I would end up in innovation. I know you speak to so many of us, and I'm sure that there's some child in the world that is like, I don't want to just be an astronaut. I want to be an innovator.
That's right.
And I love that kid, just saying. But, for me, it was, someone said to me about a decade ago, I think you're in innovation. And I was like, oh, that makes sense, because I really like to do things first.
Right.
So, it was a growing towards it. And, I do think that what has made me good as an innovator and as an advertising woman and a person in marketing is the fact that I come from this activist space. So you've already brought up many things that to me are activist principles. When something doesn't work, when you're going against a system, how do you work around it? And so I've approached these things for different political issues, which I don't need to go down completely right now. But in that space, I've learned the power of sitting in a room of creatives and thinking collectively and instead of competitively. That to me is an activist principle. I don't have to win here. We're here to win together. In that space, I always point towards, and I do write a lot about the fact that being anti-capitalist has also made me a very good ad woman, because I'm not prescribing to the typical ways of consumerism. But again, that goes into the innovation. So by the fact that I was raised and have participated in activism through my entire adult life, I think I've learned how to take a loss, how to find the wins. And really, I base my innovation practice, I call it hope via disruption. And if that's not an activist principle, I don't know what is. Because that really is core. So yes, I do say that because, I think about, how did you end up in this space where, like, we spoke about going to other teams and saying, I'm not here to compete with you. And, that kind of headspace isn't a traditional advertising world headspace, isn't a traditional corporate headspace. So I had to look at one point and go, why do I think that? How do I operate like that without feeling a threat? And I was like, it's my activism.
That's really interesting, because, when I think of activism and activists, I think of I don't think of anybody who's like collaborative. I almost think of somebody who's the opposite of collaborative because they're trying to push their agenda. So, I mean, how are you an activist and at the same time collaborative?
Well, I think it's the collective mindset. So in a collective mindset, you know that everyone is coming from their own experiences. There's a lot of great leadership books, particularly those by Brene Brown and people in her school of thought, that talk a lot about embracing people that may have alternative concepts to what you believe. But when you approach something as a collective and you think everyone's coming from a different space, a win looks like different things. So a win doesn't have to look like you believe now what I believe. But it may be that maybe we approach it in a different way. You know, I do a lot about diversity and inclusion. I have for a long time. Racial justice is something very important to me. And oftentimes in those conversations, if I can highlight just one or two elements of something that the person hasn't thought of before and they can mull that over, that's progress. I don't need them to I mean, I'd love it if everything I wanted happened, but that is not, you know, the journey that I've been on. And I really think that it is that believing that we all are coming with who we are and everything adds to it. And together we'll create something that is tangible because our audience and our consumers, if you're marketing, are going to be coming from equally varied backgrounds and will need all of those opinions. As much as I think I have great opinions, a world of me and my opinion would be a horrible place to live.
Well, I love that concept because if you think about it, you're absolutely right. I mean, you're an activist within your organization, especially if you're working in a larger organization where you're trying to push innovative concepts and products and things like that. You're an activist working within this structure and trying to change the structure from within, trying to change the culture from within, because we all know that innovation is not really technology, it's culture. It's a cultural change, not a technology change. I could, you know, describe all sorts of new tech and just say, hey, we're going to do this, we're going to do AI, we're going to do this, but none of it is actually innovation, right?
Yeah.
All technology. Technology has nothing to do with innovation, really. It's just
and it's all movements. I mean, I don't mean to overuse the term, but it is. New technologies create new movements.
Yeah.
And we get to see how those things are embraced. So, you know, some of the ways in which I'm an activist in advertising are more traditional, because what I would say in that space is we don't want to have bias in AI. What are we doing about it? Who's developing it? What do our teams look like? You know, that's a little bit standard activism at work. But also the fact that we're even adopting these things, that's a movement. And these cultural shifts.
I'd love to hear more about your bias in AI, because if you ask me, there's no way to eliminate it, because you've got programmers. Programmers are biased, and they create the software. So unless the software creates the software that creates the software, then how many layers deep do you have to go before you eliminate bias from AI? I mean, I don't know if it's possible.
It's definitely going to take a lot of work. I will say, for whatever it's worth, you can go on my LinkedIn. I did a thing called What Breeds Bias for MadFest. It's a 10-minute video, and I give 30 different solutions for it. So I'll just...
You solved it then.
I haven't solved it. You know, one of my examples I'll use is like hiring. So lovely generations, like the younger generations, are hacking the system. So they're putting things in their resumes that you can't see, but they will break through in the AI. If you want to know if they have an MBA, sure they do. You know, like, so that's all happening and that kind of thing. But, you know, when particularly last summer, when George Floyd was murdered and there was a real push into how are we making sure that we have these diverse workplaces, one of the things I said was, you got to start reading resumes. You know, it's also when you interview people, making sure that you're having structured interviews that are actually about the bullets of the job and you're not looking for a cultural fit.
Yeah.
You know, so a lot of the time it's breaking away from it and working with it and finding that in between. And it is going into making sure that your developers are coming from different places. It's definitely not a one-term fix, but I think first we have to acknowledge that it's existing. So if we immediately fall into it, how are we going to work on it? I think a lot of things are happening in media that are exciting around this. Particularly MediaCom move their programmatic in space, and they're really looking into how do we do inclusive planning in that. And right now, to your point, inclusive planning and multicultural advertising literally is offline. Like it's a
right.
strategy consultancy coming in saying, these are the websites, these are the social, Havas has a plan of social equity, and it's all different social sites that happen to be minority owned. And that is all on paper with a pen, basically.
Yeah, hasn't been systematized yet.
But as we do that, we will be teaching AI to be smarter. So I'm an advisor at IV.AI, and it's something that we work on quite a bit, is how do we take these understandings of people and help it inform AI in the future. So, by its nature, if we keep talking to it smarter and moving it in different directions, we'll get a myriad of voices. I also think we have to, because of the fact of the younger generation is too intersectional to be able to define them so simply.
Well, I think the whole talent system, the whole talent acquisition system is broken, yes. Right? Because everything goes through these static filters, and you never get to see the real authentic individual behind these things. I mean, you've got the resumes, you've got the interviews. These are all sort of manufactured objects that don't represent the real individual at the end. In fact, I'm more into going back to some kind of apprentice system where you just bring somebody in, have them work for a bit, and see how they work out.
Yeah. I read this hilarious story about, which is unfortunate, but it's an interesting point of kind of an IRL version of this woman wanted to apply for a job, and she didn't know how to write the right cover letter. So she put the job posting on like a Craigslist and got like 400 submissions and picked the cover letter she liked and submitted it. And she got the job.
She did? That's fantastic.
It's not AI, but it sure is clever. But you're exactly right. And I think what's wonderful about right now is we get to really explore what that looks like, because, no surprise, the job market is at an all-time intensive right now. We're having all our conversations like this. So like you're saying, the apprentice thing, I spend a lot of time thinking about how are we supporting emerging talent. I mentioned to you earlier that I never thought I would be an innovator. My career was based on being by a water cooler and being like, oh, what do you do? That was the beginning. It was never defined as clean cut as I think I would have liked it. I'm just not that person. I'm an explorer. I'm sure, most of your listeners are, and so on, the nature of who we are as innovators. But as how are you providing that apprenticeship that's more than how are you serving me? Often, like I do a lot of mentoring, and I had a mentorship session with one of my mentees, and she said, you're the only mentor in this one program that I support that has done a second meeting with me.
Interesting.
And
yeah, so well, it absolutely works both ways, right? I mean, you're talking about it's not just an employer-employee relationship. It's, are you both getting something out of it? And the thing is that these systems that we're using to select employees are so artificial. When the person actually gets onto the job, it's kind of like, is this really what I want to do? That's why you have such high turnover, because, moments in, especially nowadays with at least my younger generation, my kids are telling me, oh yeah, I was working there. And after about a month, I was like this senior guy because everybody else just churned in and out so quickly. So yeah, talent is definitely something we need. Talent acquisition is definitely something that needs to be worked on.
Yeah, I was on a panel once with a guy from Microsoft that does a lot of that technology. And I just turned to him and I said, I just want to let you know that your technology would never hire me.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah, exactly.
I wouldn't even get to an interview.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I can see that. So since we're tackling talent, what about education? Where are you on that?
In terms of how people are educated and them coming into the system?
About blowing up the educational system, because I think that's another thing that needs to be disrupted.
I'm not as deep into it because I kind of take people where I can first mess with them, and I don't have children, so I don't get to mess with those children in that. But obviously our current system is in the place that it's in. I think where I stand with it in terms of an opinion is I would like to see the people that are exploring it and know it to find that solution. Where I think and I struggle with as someone more on the startup side and in the VC world is, and I'll just name it, but I don't think Mark Zuckerberg knows the future of education.
Right.
And so when people like that start investing and saying, I know how to solve this, but they're not professionals in it, that's where I get worried.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my approach is, I think grassroots ways of approaching are really good, and listen to people that are around. And I'm not for privately funded Silicon Valley versions of education being the way forward.
Yeah, and I think education being as monolithic as it is definitely something that needs to change, because people learn in all different ways, in all different places, all through life. So the monolithic sort of degree programs and things that people need to get into specific roles are probably not necessarily more. You have coding boot camps, you have all sorts of ways in which to educate individuals so that they can do what they want to do without having to have them go through this system from the early 20th century, which still doesn't even work very well.
Well, I mean, you're speaking to someone that doesn't have a college degree. So
I don't have one either.
There you go. Exactly. So we're just two little diamonds happening, out there in the rough. So, I mean, it's like, I'm an exact product of that,
Yeah.
in that space. And so, I'm going to advance it into that emerging talent conversation. One of the solutions that I've been discussing with clients and also sharing in conversations is that I think one of the ways forward is, and the term I'm going to use is members clubs, but I don't want to have the walls up to that.
Yeah, it sounds a little exclusive.
Exactly. More, there's so many great, like there's She Runs It, which is for women in advertising that now has about 10,000 members. So it's not a Soho house. So you have different groups for, different specialties. Even on LinkedIn, there's great groups that you can just like have a chat with. Now with the new Clubhouse app, people are in groups there. And it's making sure that there's those access points, because I think that I want to make sure that everyone has the option to explore, no matter what we're doing. So what I've been saying is my team, where I used to send them to conferences, I now want to make sure they have year-long memberships into certain groups that they can go to talks that have mentorship hours, that have speed dating, ways in which they can just be curious.
Yeah.
That's, that is what my job, I feel like, is to provide the places to be curious, to be wrong, to ask questions. And to me, that's how I learned. That's the education path that served me the best, was to go that way, And I think that particularly the younger generation, one of the things that we have to be mindful of if we're in big companies and so on is Gen Z doesn't think they need to be a part of the system.
Yeah.
So you have to make it really attractive to want to show up for that salary job.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I think that if we're talking about the world of work, I think eventually we're all going to be running 5 or 6 different jobs, Uber style, and then we'll flip on and off whether we're working for company A, company B, company C, depending on what we're doing at the moment. And if you go really far out, you're going to have algorithms assigning tasks to us. Oh, you happen to be walking past a park. Why don't you do some sweeping and we'll pay you a few bucks? But that's in the far future.
I can see what you mean, though. I mean, it is that question of why were we valuing time as how you spend? I mean, I can tell you, just as being a freelancer and a consultant and going into companies, I've never worked as little as you do when you actually are in a company. Like,
oh yeah, exactly.
When you're like, and that does not mean that I don't hustle and work. That is not something anyone would ever say about me, but so much wasted time, so much wasted time, but in a confined space. And so now that we've really broken through that, I think it's that, it's that valuing. We are Rosie, who's quite forward thinking in the flex work space. You know, it's moving, they've talked a little bit about it, but are we going to move from an hourly rate and a daily rate to just project rates?
Yeah, yeah, it's entirely possible. Well, I mean, I think you're seeing the same thing I am, is that, you know, I mean, this might sound dumb, but it seems like full-time employees rarely doing the actual work. It's mostly politicking and making sure that, you know, all the, you know, they're in line and their asses are covered. But, you know, maybe 80% politicking, 20% work, and then it's the consultants that do the 80% of work and 20% politicking. I mean, do you see that too?
Yes. I don't know about those percentages. I think it varies on the team member, but yes, I mean, there's plenty of people that I'm just like, oh, okay. So this is what happens. Again, I was freelance for a long time and a consultant for a long time. So when I work these long jobs, I'm like, this is fascinating. Look at this.
Well, I find it so interesting because if you think about it, I mean, these people, they have all of these benefits and they have perks, and the companies protect them. And I'm like, but they're not doing most of the work. It's your outside people who are doing most of the work. But it just feels strange that there's this imbalance there. You'd think that they'd be actually taking on the brunt of the operations. But I think Google's like that too, right? Aren't they like more than half contractor?
Yeah, and it's just moving more and more. So, you know, we're all going to see this heavily shift. We'll just be curious for us to see how this changes. You know, what happens to commercial real estate after COVID is something I'm still in conversations around.
Oh yeah, well, I'm confused that it's still as expensive as it is, and especially even residential real estate, especially around here where you've got you know, tiny little boxes near the BART station going for $800,000, and I'm like, those are still going for $800,000. Yeah, I'm stunned.
I think there's a bit of like, I had this conversation actually with an activist friend the other day because I mean, I'm in Los Angeles. Homelessness is, I mean, I think it is the worst in the country.
Yeah.
Here, it is also, to be fair, you've done well if you've landed in Southern California. Just think about the East Coast right now, buried in a blizzard. So if you're houseless, it's a better of a side. I'm not going to say it's a win, but the weather is a friend. But it really has just grown, of course, during this time, and it's only going to grow further. That's in these economics, like there's just no way it's turning. Los Angeles has also continued to have people move here during COVID, which has just been very surreal. And there's a certain area of East Los Angeles that I was by that was heavily gentrified. So exactly like you're talking about in terms of right near the BART station, 800,000, and you're like, what's going on? Same thing, just in an area in LA. And it looks a little bit like Mad Max over in this neighborhood now. Jeez. It really does. It has a real energy of that time. I've actually never seen it. I've lived in that neighborhood. I don't live there now, but like I moved to LA in the early noughties and it was not like this. So, you know, so it goes. But the point being is that people were still paying incredible amounts. And I don't know if people don't understand what crime looks like. And I'm not paralleling crime to houselessness, but there is definitely a vibe happening when you have an anarchist village, which I kind of appreciate on some level, but happening in a time that we're in a total economic crisis.
I kind of appreciate anarchy every now and then.
I do too. Like, I'm all for abolishing a system and living outside of it. But some of it is not by choice. There's a lot of other experiences. I'm not going to go down that, but the point is that there's still a $1.5 million house right on the corner of this.
Yeah. I find that insane. And especially if you want to go into one more thing, it's like housing. Housing is ridiculous. I don't understand how you know, you can't find anything in Southern California under $500,000, even tiny little. It's like, why can't we figure out some way of building homes that are affordable? It just seems to me that it's just a people problem, not a technology problem.
I would absolutely agree it's a people problem. I'm a city girl, so I grew up in New York City. I'm loving right now because so many people have left New York City. As I mentioned, it hasn't happened like that in Los Angeles. But, you know, I think that it was an interesting turn that I've actually lived through because, you know, there was the generation for many years that after a certain point, you moved to the suburbs, and that was the way in which you, quote, made it.
Yeah.
And then that stopped happening. And people started to make bigger apartments in New York City. People started to stay with their families in the center of these cities and so on. And it looks like for the most part, Los Angeles not as the example, but San Francisco for sure, that is breaking right now.
Yeah.
And so it will be curious what happens. I'm interested in, with all of the commercial real estate that clearly has no reason to exist at the volume it does right now. Just the future of work cannot be office towers.
No. They have to turn it into housing. We just have to
so how will that solve things? What will that do with that amount of land and that amount of accommodation? Will there be a shift in that to what you're saying? I'm curious.
Yeah, well, I think it can be done. I mean, I think I've seen it done temporarily in some places where they basically create cubicles, you know, little home cubicles in these, and that's just temporary, right? Until they can turn them into something a little more apartment-like. But there's no reason why it can't be done. That's what I'm saying. It's like, it's always like the government or the state or some agency saying, because of these zoning restrictions or whatever. I mean, it's like the San Francisco apartment rule is every apartment must be at least 250 square feet or something like that. There's people living in the world in much smaller accommodations than that and much less expensive accommodations than that. But we can't house people like that. I mean, we should be able to look at it on a global scale and say, how much space does a human being really need? And look at it from, you know, can we create living units that people can live in and have them at a reasonable price, so we don't have this type of you know, ridiculous housing prices and homelessness.
It's a curious question. I mean, I think when it gets into space and city living, I think a lot about Hong Kong. I'm curious what's happening in Hong Kong because there's expected to be a very large exodus shortly,
Right.
with a number of the British passport holders going to the UK.
Yeah.
But you know, as you know, Hong Kong, isn't it the highest square footage in the world?
It's pretty dense. Yeah. I'm not sure if Beijing is ahead of it, but it's pretty dense. And I mean, I saw an article.
What you're paying for it.
They had these tiny little spaces, maybe like 10, 15, 20 feet between buildings. And they were actually creating these apartment tubes. They're like tube apartments that they were just pushing into the space, and each person, and you know, there was like a bed and all of that. There was enough room for somebody to live in. I mean, it wasn't huge, but it was enough space for somebody to live in. And I think we just have to, you know, review that and look at it again and say,
there is a tiny house project in Los Angeles that just got launched that is meant to be a bridge to, it's meant to be a starter home for someone that's in this social care setup to move forward in. And so they do have these tiny homes. I think it's also curious, you know, what the standard apartment is now just going to be different. You know, the concept of like that closet space may instead now, you know, be an office space. In New York, they now all have washer dryers, which was unheard of in New York City for years, but now no one wants to do public laundry, you know, like that kind of things that are just not in the comfortable lexicon kind of thing, like little things like that. So, you know, everything architecturally is going to have such a major advancement in terms of priorities in that. So, you know, those tube sleeping spaces, I've seen some where you can just like stay when you get off the plane in Japan, you can just like go stay in a tube.
The little coffin hotels or whatever the heck they call them. That was good. So let's talk about the future. 2031. It's 2031. What's the world going to be like in 2031?
What I hope or what I think? Well, technologically, because we are talking innovation, I really hope that it's based on that I can do a lot with my hands.
Right.
I have been a huge fan of gesture technology. I love the passiveness of it. I mean, I think it's because I also love like mod culture. So I love a little flair. The whole thing, I just appreciate it. And I'll use that as the sort of headline for all that I think of. I don't think we're going to even snap out of the cultural shift that has occurred even in 10 years. On the collaboration innovation board that I was on at Hyundai, it was 25 years into the future. So, I think it's important to know, if I stay with gesture, I really think we've reprioritized. And what this looks like and what our future innovations, as you mentioned earlier, culture led always. So I think the things that connect us may be a little bit further into the intimate variety of, how are we making gestures of inclusivity for each other? Creating safe spaces. I think in the immediate, there's that response. So in the next few years, it's how are we making sure that we're addressing the climate and being socially responsible in these ways so that we have a future. But all of that work towards it, I think, really comes down to how am I making gestures in the world that support each other, that support the community I want to live in? That space of having, I think particularly like non-relationships, heavy travel, heavy business travel, most of that is gone now. And I don't think we're going to have it licked in a year. Some things will take 10 years. So if I think about 2031 to your question, I really think it's a time of intended gestures to help each other in humanity, that we still have a closeness because we've lived through this experience. And I think what the youth do, of the generation that will be making products and doing all those things, they've lived through this and they know what they want on the other side. So how are they going to still do their TikTok dances in 10 years? That camaraderie, that fun, I think will be a thread through.
Really, thread through?
A thread through. Like they'll be like, oh, we had that time together. That was really valuable to me to spend like 2 hours learning a TikTok dance. I'm not saying they're going to do Dance Revolution in 10 years or anything like that. But I am saying they've reprioritized at a younger age. So you have your 15-year-old that has gone through this experience, has experienced being locked in a non-conducive home for such things that were built around the idea of transience happening. That hasn't happened. They've lived through that. So anything they create and invest in and bring to the culture will be affected by that. And I think we'll live in a smaller, more intended space because of that.
Fantastic. This has been great. Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. I love it. So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
I'm at Miss Mordecai, MS Mordecai, Mordecai, across social. So please follow me there. I'm on LinkedIn as Mordecai, very simple. I think I'm the only one named Mordecai there. So join my mononymous train, however you like. If you've got a few syllables, make them work for you.
I love it. Thank you so much. It was great talking with you.
Thanks, Chris. It was really great to chat.
Bye.
Bye.